Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 547, Getting Meta. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I am well. I have two of my favorite chapters for you today. Ha! There you are. But first, and today is really going to be just about the book, I have two voicemails for you. Again, you too can call in and leave a voicemail at 206-350-1642. Here first is Amy from Seattle. And I'm sorry I wasn't there to talk to you about this Thursday night. My eyes were glued shut from exhaustion, and I just couldn't stand up anymore or sit up anymore or anything. But thank you for calling in to enlighten us, Amy. Here she is telling us a little bit about the books upon which Netflix's Bridgerton is based. Amy, take it away.
Hi, Heather. Hi, Craftlit folks. This is Amy near Seattle, and I'm responding, Heather, to your call for those of us who have read the Bridgerton books in response to how those of us who've read them feel about the Netflix adaptation. I'm a big fan of Julia Quinn, that's the author, and I'm a big fan of historical romance, particularly Regency romance, mainly for the reason that I love a happy ending. And when you're going to pick up a romance novel, when the world is stressful and you just need to escape, you are guaranteed a happy ending when you pick up a romance novel. Person meets person, they fall in love, and at the end they're either getting married or they're happy in their marriage, and it's all good. As far as Bridgerton goes, I love the adaptation. It is not a a word-for-word, picture-perfect adaptation. It probably couldn't have been. You can't very well, I think, if you're going to focus on all 8 siblings, do it in the standard way that a romance novelist does, where the first book in the series is only about the boy and the girl who are the main characters of that book. So in the Netflix adaptation, we're seeing a lot of the siblings' backstories that come up later in the novels. So like book 1 is only about Daphne and Simon, and the siblings are all there and they're supportive, but you don't know about these backstories that are happening. So a lot of the stuff that happened concurrently we didn't know about, and we don't actually know about a lot of it in the books. So there's a lot of character diving and scenes that never ever happen in the books, which is very cool. They're coming out in Netflix. One of the things I really love about it is that I'm as I said, a big fan of Julia Quinn, and I follow her on social media, and she very early on in the process said that she gave a lot of control over to the folks who were creating the show, and she approved the scripts and changed almost nothing in them. And she said they improved upon it, and they did things that you have to do to translate a book to film. And so I went into watching the series with the attitude of, well, if Julia loves it, who am I to say it's not right? And I love everything they did with it. And so there is a lot that's different, but they really did, for the most part, keep to the characters as we grew to know them in the books. There's maybe one thing I don't love as much. There's a very controversial action that takes place midway through the series, and I think the reaction to that action in the books is better. I don't think the reaction to it in the series was as strong as it could have been, and it's handled in a little bit different manner. But again, that's not enough to put me off of the series. Anyway, I'm really, really looking forward to season 2 and hope they actually pick it up for all 8 seasons so we get to see everybody's stories play out. And I'm really interested in some of the changes they made to the future stories, because one of them has already been a big, big, big change, and it really adds some depth to the stories. So that is my take on the translation of Julia Quinn's Bridgerton series to the Shondaland fantastic television series. And if you want more details on a personal level that are spoilers for people who haven't watched it, find me on Facebook, Heather, and we'll chat about it. Take care. I'm really excited for Northanger Abbey. I've never read it, and I laughed my way through the first chapter. It's fantastic. Thanks so much. Take care. Talk to you later.
So yes, now Bridgerton is on my list because it sounds like fun. Actually, Amy, I need to confess, you were the one who first made me think that I wanted to watch Bridgerton. And I have enjoyed it. I cannot lie. Everybody here has enjoyed it. So, yay. It makes me feel better too that someone who actually knows the books, read the books, and loves the books has also enjoyed the Netflix. We have also heard, as of this morning, from Scaroliz. I love that is your name on Ravelry. Calling in with a very, very pertinent question because it was the same question I had. Here we go.
Hey, Heather. It is Sarah Blake, Scaroliz on the internet. Is it just me, or does Catherine Morland have ADHD? That's it. That's the whole message. Bye.
So I wish I could show you my notebook from the first time I listened to the book, because I got to the descriptions in the first chapter of Catherine Morland's inability to sit still or learn anything. I mean, clearly she does. She learns stuff and she reads a lot, but she really only reads about the thing that she obsesses about, which is currently Gothic novels. Did I think she was ADHD? Yes, I did. Yes, I did. There are several other reasons throughout the book that I think Jane Austen probably knew somebody who was very, very like Catherine Morland, if it wasn't she herself that she was talking about, which is possible, but I'm not positive. Yeah. So Catherine's an interesting, not a heroine. Oh, there's more. There's more in store for you today on the Not a Heroine front. We are going to listen to chapters 2 and 3. Chapter 3 introduces one of my favorite characters in all of Austenian literature, in one of my favorite scenes in all of Austenian literature that I have so far read. I love the scene you are about to listen to. And I want to tell you, and it brings me great joy to say this, the movie version that I mentioned last week, the movie version not only nailed this scene, it almost made it better. And that's because they pretty much lifted the entire scene straight out of the book and put it onto the silver screen. It used to be silver. Now it's black and rectangular and in our living room. They did a marvelous job with this. So, opening chapters. What do you need to know for chapters 2 and 3? Here we go. Mrs. Allen. We are not done with Mrs. Allen, nor will we be done with her for a while. And I don't mean done with her as in we never see her again, or done with her as in we're sick of seeing her. In fact, she is one of my favorite characters in this book. She is Dickensian in her limitations. And I mean that if you went back and if you had listened to Bleak House, or if you have gone back and gotten the audio to listen to Bleak House, there are characters in there who are very much a Johnny One Note. They are always talking about or obsessing about a single thing. I'm thinking very clearly right now of, and she's not the only example, but the one that's coming to mind is Mrs. Jellaby, the one who is raising money to help missionaries get to Africa, and feel as one might about people spending a lot of money and time sending missionaries to Africa during the Victorian era. Putting that aside, she is an appalling human being. She is an appalling human being who is so limited that she cannot notice the damage that she's doing to her children and how blind she is about who her children actually have become. Mrs. Allen is not a toxic character like that, but she is obsessive in a similar way. She simply has no ability to view herself interacting in public with other people, and absolutely cracks me up. You will hear her, in fact, almost always recite at least the last few words or the last sentence of the person who spoke previously as the beginning of her sentence. And then she might add something to it. It is almost always not of consequence. But somehow she still cracks me up. And you won't even get to see the funniest bit about her in today's 2 chapters. You'll still see funny, but you won't see the funniest bit yet. So there will be more Mrs. Allen. Pay attention. Pay attention to going shopping with Mrs. Allen. Oh, she's fun. Okay. She also fails to be a gothic character. She's completely unsuited to being villainous. She is not going to trap Catherine. She is not going to make Catherine do anything Catherine doesn't want to do. She's an absolute and utter failure as a gothic villainess. So, okay, so Mrs. Allen. Another character in today's chapters, to a certain extent, is Bath. And Bath is very interesting at this time in history. And actually, Jane Austen does throw one detail in here to let us know that it must be taking place sometime around 1805, which means this is something that she tweaked after she originally wrote the book. And how do we know this? We know this because she drops a name. It will go by so quickly, and I never noticed it, but I am reading some annotations in several different versions of Northanger Abbey. Yes, there are annotated versions of Northanger Abbey. Why? Because Jane Austen is brilliant. Okay, back to the book. So she drops a name, and I will give you that name in a minute. But first, she drops a name of a character who has an elective office. He is the Master of Ceremonies in Bath. Yes, there was one at a time. The original one was first brought into office in 1704. His name was Richard Beau Nash, Nash. He was in office from 1704 until his death in 1764. It's a long run. His job was to be kind of they called him the Master of Ceremonies, but he was kind of the concierge to the city for all of these people who were coming into Bath during the season. The season at the time that Austen is writing was stretching from September to about May. Our story takes place sometime around February. Regardless, Mr. Nash, what were his duties as Master of Ceremonies? Good of you to ask. He basically kept things moving along in a proper direction at the festivities that took place at the baths. There's the upper room, lower room, pump house. These are the 3 locations where the mineral water, the warm mineral water, is pumped up from the natural spring underneath Bath. So there are these 3 locations where people can go and congregate. There's ballroom, there's meeting rooms, there's tea rooms, there's all of this stuff. You can still go see them. You can still go sign, last time I was there, you could still go sign the guest book. It's still a thing. But the other thing that the Master of Ceremonies was expected to do was to keep an eye on the young ladies and gentlemen who were coming to Bath and give them an opportunity to be introduced properly, even though they were largely at that point a city of strangers who had come into town to check out the other strangers if they were young, and to drink the warm mineral healing waters of Bath. Lest we think that this was silly, there are still maladies that you will see people recommend drinking mineral water for. Some of them are digestive, some of them are other, because if the minerals in the water include, say, magnesium, there are several things that magnesium can help fix. Ticks are one of them, which I learned by having unique children. So the Master of Ceremonies is Yenta, kind of, really. He's got a job to do. Now, I said that there was a name that Jane Austen dropped. She dropped the name of the Master of Ceremonies who was there when she was there. And his tenure was from 1785 to 1805. So this book has to take place either in 1805 or earlier. The other things that the Master of Ceremonies was in charge of was arranging for music, dealing with 500 or 600 people coming in who wanted to pre-book tables. And 500 or 600 people, I mean, that's like on a day, that many people may circulate through any of the 3 rooms. Because we know that there were, at one point during the height of the time that Jane Austen was going to Bath or living in Bath, 40,000 people came through Bath during a season. 40,000 people. Just to put that out there. The Master of Ceremonies was also known for doing things like paying attention to the gambling. There were back rooms where the men could gamble while the women danced with young men and, looked at other women, especially their headdresses. Headdresses were very much a thing at this time, kind of feathery, ostrichy, feathery things. There's some very funny cartoons about that from this time period. But regardless, the Master of Ceremonies was expected to a certain extent to protect gamblers, say younger, less experienced gamblers, from being taken by some card shark, which I thought was kind of lovely, actually. He also, and this just explains a little bit more why Bath was so popular at the time. He also decided that, Nash, the original one, decided that he was going to a large extent, ignore class barriers. So it didn't matter what your rank in society was. If he thought that you two young people were going to have a lovely time dancing together, it didn't matter where you came from. If you managed to get to Bath and you looked decent, you could dance with each other. This seemed to me to be marvelously egalitarian and really special. I don't recall ever reading anything like that before from this time period, or actually from any of the time periods that we have read about on Craftlit in the last almost 15 years. So that was fun. There is a running joke that starts in chapter 2 and ends in chapter 3. Well, ends in quotation marks in chapter 3. Catherine's mother is going to talk to her about money and ask her to keep a record of the money that she spends. And in doing so, she gives her a journal, a little book that she can write her expenses in. Pay attention in chapter 3 to where the word journal gets used again. It is another, albeit very subtle way, that Catherine also fails to be a Gothic heroine. Guineas. We come across this term every so often in the books that we read. And just as a reminder, a guinea is a gold 1 pound coin. There were banknotes at this time. Those would have been passing hands as well. For our purposes, though, guineas pop up here in chapter 2. And just to give you a sum as a point of reference, Jane Austen at one point sold her piano for 8 guineas. Just remember that. 8 guineas equals Jane Austen's piano. I'm going to try and relocate a video for you that Bernadette Banner, I think it's on her channel, but it may be that she did an introduction for somebody else. That's why I'm going to try and find it and put it in the show notes for you. It's a video where friends of hers in New York have a woman with very long hair sitting on stage, and while they're discussing dress and structure garments, they are doing her hair in a pomaded style. I cannot for the life of me remember which era they are replicating. I think it's the early late 1700s, like 1770-ish, but I'm not at all positive about that. Either way, they use frames, pomade, and powder, and it finally makes sense why you would want to do this to your hair at all. It also makes so much sense why people had sleeping caps. Total sense now after watching that video, which I saw maybe a year ago. So I really am going to have to go look for it. The reason I bring it up is because Mrs. Allen does say at one point that somebody hurt her head. She is talking about her hair. She's talking about her hair. Also remember that because of the way structural garments were built at this time, if you were wearing a very fancy dress, it is very likely that parts of that dress were pinned to the foundation garments, not to you, but to the fabric that was there on top of, say, whalebone or some other kind of boning. You weren't necessarily going to have a pin stick you unless somebody really jarred you or knocked into you and things became askew, in which place one of those pins could be dislodged. So that's another thing you're going to hear in today's chapters. Now, if you think back to when we did North and South, muslin was a huge topic of conversation. There were muslins being made in England. This is some of the factory work that everybody hears about from this particular time period. Muslin that I grew up with was muslin that was used to make flats in the theater. It was thick. It was not particularly lovely. This is not that muslin. The muslin that they're talking about is very lightweight, gauzy if you really got good muslin. And if you wanted the best at the time, before the Scottish and Northern English mills kind of took over, Indian muslin from India was spectacular. Also, not cheap. Dresses were made of this muslin. Sometimes men's cravats, and they had those stiff collars and the cravat, different from how men would wear a cravat these days, slightly different. Headscarves we've seen in those kind of neo-Grecian images of women in Jane Austen's times, with the hair curls and the headscarves that were tied up in that neoclassical way. That would have been muslin as well. Sometimes they were called headscarves, sometimes they were called handkerchiefs. In a conversation about the ride from their home, which is Fullerton and is said to be 9 miles away from Salisbury, the distance that they would likely have traveled from home to Bath was 46 miles. That would have taken about 6 hours of travel time, and they probably would have stopped to get out, change horses, all of that. They wore clogs, and the clogs are very similar to clogs that you and I would think of. They were leather or wood and leather. They often were big and clunky because they fit over your nice shoes, so that if you sank down into some mud when you were getting in and out of the carriage, you wouldn't completely destroy the shoes you were wearing. But this also comes up because Catherine uses some slang in our second chapter today, chapter 3. She's talking about the trip and said that she'd done it before in going from home to Salisbury, but she'd never gone the second leg from Salisbury to Bath. And she said, Mr. Allen said it's 9 or measured 9, but I am sure it cannot be more than 8. That's the ride to Salisbury. And it's such a fag. Now, I've heard of fagging being another word, or being used as another word for something that is fatiguing. I've never heard it shortened this way, but being used to mean the same thing. So when she says that, she means it's a long way and it's tiring. And then, of course, she did, 3 times as much, almost, to get to Bath. So very fatiguing. And one thing I missed, chair. At one point, I think it is at the very end of chapter 2, the narrator says that Catherine went to her chair in good humor with everybody and perfectly satisfied with her share of public attention. Going to her chair is going to a sedan chair. These are the chairs that you could ride on where 2 poles were attached to the sides of the chair, and then 2 men, one in front of you and one behind you, would carry you to where you were going. This became a popular thing in Bath at this time because the old streets of Bath are very narrow and you couldn't always get a carriage through them. So this was one way to be taken home after hours in a way that allowed your fatiguing body to not have to work quite so hard. However, Bath being Bath because of the medicinal curative quality of the water also had a bath chair system that had been developed because people sometimes needed to be taken from their bedside to the baths in order to receive medical attention. So it was kind of a thing. Some of the homes were designed to be able to accommodate chairs going in and out of the homes themselves, which is kind of cool. All right, chapters 2 and 3. I will reveal the reason behind the name of today's episode on the flip side. Here we go with chapters 2 and 3 of Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, read for us by the fabulous Maya Daguerre. Here we go.
Chapter 2. In addition to what has already been said of Catherine Morland's personal and mental endowments, when about to be launched into all the difficulties and dangers of a 6 weeks' residence in Bath, it may be stated for the reader's more certain information, lest the following pages should otherwise fail of giving any idea of what her character is meant to be, that her heart was affectionate, her disposition cheerful and open, without conceit or affectation of any kind. Her manners just removed from the awkwardness and shyness of a girl, her person pleasing, and, when in good looks, pretty, and her mind about as ignorant and uninformed as the female mind at 17 usually is. When the hour of departure drew near, the maternal anxiety of Mrs. Morland will be naturally supposed to be most severe. 1,000 alarming presentments of evil to her beloved Catherine from this terrific separation must oppress her heart with sadness and drown her in tears for the last day or two of their being together, and advice of the most important and applicable nature must of course flow from her wise lips in their parting conference in her closet. Cautions against the violence of such noblemen and baronets as delight in forcing young ladies away to some remote farmhouse must at such a moment relieve the fullness of her heart. Who would not think so? But Mrs. Morland knew little of lords and baronets, that she entertained no notion of their general mischievousness, and was wholly unsuspicious of danger to her daughter from their machinations. Her cautions were confined to the following points. I beg, Catherine, that you will always wrap yourself up very warm around the throat when you come from the rooms at night, and I wish you would try to keep some account of the money you spend. I will give you this little book on purpose. Sally, or rather Sarah, for what young lady of common gentility will reach the age of 16 without altering her name as far as she can, must from situation be at this time the intimate friend and confidant of her sister. It is remarkable, however, that she neither insisted on Catherine's writing by every post, nor exacted her promise of transmitting the character of every new acquaintance, nor a detail of every interesting conversation that Bath might produce. Everything, indeed, relative to this important journey was done on the part of the Morlands with a degree of moderation and composure which seemed rather consistent with the common feelings of common life than with the refined susceptibilities, the tender emotions which the first separation of a heroine from her family ought always to excite. Her father, instead of giving her an unlimited order on his banker, or even putting £100 bank bill into her hands, gave her only 10 guineas and promised her more when she wanted it. Under these unpromising auspices, the parting took place and the journey began. It was performed with suitable quietness and uneventful safety. Neither robbers nor tempests befriended them, nor one lucky overturn to introduce them to the hero. Nothing more alarming occurred than a fear on Mrs. Allen's side of having once left her clogs behind at an inn, and that fortunately proved to be groundless. They arrived at Bath. Catherine was all eager delight. Her eyes were here, there, everywhere as they approached its fine and striking environs, and afterwards drove through those streets which conducted them to the hotel. She was come to be happy, and she felt happy already. They were soon settled in comfortable lodgings in Pulteney Street. It is now expedient to give some description of Mrs. Allen, that the reader may be able to judge in what manner her actions will hereafter tend to promote the general distress of the work, and how she will probably contribute to reduce poor Catherine to all the desperate wretchedness of which the last volume is capable, whether by her imprudence, vulgarity, or jealousy, whether by intercepting her letters, ruining her character, or turning her out of doors. Mrs. Allen was one of the numerous class of females whose society can raise no other emotion than surprise at there being any men in the world who could like them well enough to marry them. She had neither beauty, genius, accomplishment, nor manner. The air of a gentlewoman, a great deal of quiet, inactive good temper, and a trifling turn of mind were all that could account for her being the choice of a sensible, intelligent man like Mr. Allen. In one respect, she was admirably fitted to introduce a young lady into public, being as fond of going everywhere and seeing everything herself as any young lady could be. Dress was her passion. She had a most harmless delight in being fine, and our heroine's entree into life could not take place till after 3 or 4 days had been spent in learning what was mostly worn, and her chaperone was provided with a dress of newest fashion. Catherine, too, made some purchases herself, and when all these matters were arranged, The important evening came, which was to usher her into the upper rooms. Her hair was cut and dressed by the best hand, her clothes put on with care, and both Mrs. Allen and her maid declared she looked quite as she should do. With such encouragement, Catherine hoped at least to pass uncensured through the crowd. As for admiration, it was always very welcome when it came, but she did not depend on it. Mrs. Allen was so long in dressing that they did not enter the ballroom till late. The season was full, the room crowded, and the two ladies squeezed in as well as they could. As for Mr. Allen, he repaired directly to the card room and left them to enjoy the mob by themselves. With more care for the safety of her new gown than from the comfort of her protégée, Mrs. Allen made her way through the throng of men by the door as swiftly as the necessary caution would allow. Catherine, however, kept close at her side and linked her arm too firmly within her friend's to be torn asunder by any common effort of a struggling assembly. But to her utter amazement, she found that to proceed along the room was by no means the way to disengage themselves from the crowd. It seemed rather to increase as they went on, whereas she had imagined that when once fairly within the door, they should easily find seats and be able to watch the dances with perfect convenience. But this was far from being the case, and though by unwearied diligence they gained even the top of the room, their situation was just the same. They saw nothing of the dancers, but the high feathers of some of the ladies. Still they moved on. Something better was yet in view, and by a continued exertion of strength and ingenuity, they found themselves at last in the passage behind the highest bench. Here there was something less of a crowd than below, and hence Miss Morland had a comprehensive view of all the company beneath her, and of all the dangers in her late passage through them. It was a splendid sight, and she began for the first time that evening to feel herself at a ball. She longed to dance, but she had not an acquaintance in the room. Mrs. Allen did all that she could in such a case by saying very placidly every now and then, "I wish you could dance, my dear. I wish you could get a partner." For some time her friend felt obliged to her for those wishes, but they were repeated so often and proved so totally ineffectual that Catherine grew tired at last and would thank her no more. They were not long able, however, to enjoy the repose of the eminence they had so laboriously gained. Everybody was short in motion for tea, and they must squeeze out like the rest. Catherine began to feel something of a disappointment. She was tired of being continually pressed against by people, the generality of whose faces possessed nothing of interest, and with all of whom she was so wholly unacquainted that she could not relieve the irksomeness of imprisonment by the exchange of a syllable with any of her fellow captives. And when at last arrived in the tea-room, she felt yet more awkwardness of having no party to join, no acquaintance to claim, no gentleman to assist them. They saw nothing of Mr. Allen, and after looking about them in vain for a more eligible situation, were obliged to sit down at the end of a table at which a large party were already placed, without having anything to do there or anybody to speak to except each other. Mrs. Allen congratulated herself as soon as they were seated on having preserved her gown from injury. "It would have been very shocking to have it torn," she said, "would it not? It's such a delicate muslin. For my part, I have not seen anything I like so well in the whole room, I assure you." "How uncomfortable it is," whispered Catherine, "not to have a single acquaintance here." "Yes, my dear," replied Mrs. Allen with perfect serenity. "It is very uncomfortable indeed." "What shall we do? The gentlemen and ladies at this table look as if they wondered why we came here. We seem forcing ourselves into their party." "Aye, so we do. It is very disagreeable. I wish we had a large acquaintance here." "I wish we had any. It would be somebody to go to." "Very true, my dear, and if we knew anybody, we would join them directly. The Skinners were here last year. I wish they were here now." "Had we not better go away as it is? Here are no tea things for us, you see." "No more there are, indeed. How very provoking. But I think we should better sit, for one gets so tumbled in such a crowd. How is my head, my dear? Somebody gave me a push that hurt it, I'm afraid." "No, indeed, it looks very nice. But, dear Mrs. Allen, are you sure there is nobody you know in all this multitude of people? I think you must know somebody." "I don't, upon my word. I wish I did. I wish I had a large acquaintance here with all my heart, and then I should get you a partner. I should be so glad to have you dance. There goes a strange-looking woman. What an odd gown she has got on. How old-fashioned it is. Look at the back. After some time, they received an offer of tea from one of their neighbours, and it was thankfully accepted. And this introduced a light conversation with the gentleman who offered it, which was the only time that anyone spoke to them during the evening, till they were discovered and joined by Mr. Allen when the dance was over. "Well, Miss Morland," said he directly, "I hope you have had an agreeable ball." "Very agreeable indeed," she replied, vainly endeavouring to hide a great yawn. "I wish she'd been able to dance," said his wife. "I wish we could have got a partner for her. I've been saying how glad I should have been if the Skinners were here this winter instead of last, or if the Parrys had come, as they talked of once. She might have danced with George Parry. I'm so sorry she has not had a partner." "We shall do better another evening, I hope," was Mr. Allen's consolation. The company began to disperse when the dancing was over, enough to leave space for the remainder to walk about in some comfort, and now was the time for a heroine who had not yet played a very distinguished part in the events of the evening to be noticed and admired. Every 5 minutes, by removing some of the crowd, gave greater openings for her charms. She was now seen by many young men who had not been near her before. Not one, however, started with a rapturous wonder on beholding her. No whispers of eager inquiry ran round the room, nor was she once called a divinity by anybody. Yet Catherine was in very good looks, and had the company only seen her 3 years before, they would now have thought her exceedingly handsome. She was looked at, however, and with some admiration, for in her own hearing 2 gentlemen pronounced her to be a pretty girl. Such words had their due effect. She immediately thought the evening pleasanter than she had found it before. Her humble vanity was contented. She felt more obliged to the 2 young men for this simple praise than a true quality heroine would have been for 15 sonnets in celebration of her charms, and went to her chair in good humour with everybody, and perfectly satisfied with her share of public attention. Chapter 3. Every morning now brought its regular duties. Shops were to be visited, some new part of the town to be looked at, and the pump room to be attended, where they paraded up and down for an hour, looking at everybody and speaking to no one. The wish of a numerous acquaintance in Bath was still uppermost with Mrs. Allen, and she repeated it after every fresh proof which every morning brought of her knowing nobody at all. They made their appearance in the lower rooms, and here fortune was more favourable to our heroine. The master of ceremonies introduced her to a very gentlemanlike young man as a partner. His name was Tilney. He seemed to be about 4 or 25, rather tall, had a pleasing countenance, a very intelligent and lively eye, and if not quite handsome, was very near it. His address was good, and Catherine felt herself in high luck. There was little leisure for speaking while they danced, but when they were seated for tea, she found him as agreeable as she had already given him credit for being. He talked with fluency and spirit, and there was an archness and pleasantry in his manner which interested, though it was hardly understood by her. After chatting some time on matters as naturally arose from the objects around them, he suddenly addressed her with, "I have hitherto been very remiss, madam, in the proper attentions of a partner here. I have not yet asked you how long you have been in Bath, whether you were ever here before, whether you have been in the upper rooms, the theatre, and the concert, and how you like the place altogether. I have been very negligent. But are you now at leisure to satisfy me in these particulars? If you are, I will begin directly." "You need not give yourself that trouble, sir." "No trouble, I assure you, madam." Then, forming his features into a set smile, and affectedly softening his voice, he added with a simpering air, "Have you been long in Bath, madam?" "About a week, sir," replied Catherine, trying not to laugh. "Really?" with affected astonishment. "Why should you be surprised, sir?" "Why, indeed," said he, in his natural tone, "but some emotion must appear to be raised by your reply, and surprise is more easily assumed and not less reasonable than any other. Now let us go on. Were you never here before, madam?" "Never, sir." "Indeed? Have you yet honoured the upper rooms?" "Yes, sir, I was there last Monday." "Have you been to the theatre?" "Yes, sir, I was at the play on Tuesday." "To the concert?" "Yes, sir, on Wednesday." "And are you altogether pleased with Bath?" "Yes, I like it very well." "Now I must give one smirk, and then we may be rational again." Catherine turned away her head, not knowing whether she might venture to laugh. "I see what you think of me," said he gravely. "I shall make but a poor figure in your journal tomorrow." "My journal?" "Yes, I know exactly what you will say. Friday went to the lower rooms, wore my sprigged muslin robe with blue trimmings, plain black shoes, appeared to much advantage, but was strangely harassed by a queer half-witted man who would make me dance with him and distress me by his nonsense." "Indeed, I shall say no such thing." "Shall I tell you what you ought to say?" "If you please." "I danced with a very agreeable young man introduced by Mr. King, and had a great deal of conversation with him. Seems a most extraordinary genius. I hope I may know more of him." That, madam, is what I wish you to say. "But perhaps I keep no journal." "Perhaps you are not sitting in this room, and I am not sitting by you. These are points in which doubt is equally possible. Not keep a journal? How are your absent cousins to understand the tenor of your life in Bath without one? How are the civilities and compliments of every day to be related as they ought to be, unless noted down every evening in a journal? How are your various dresses to be remembered, and the particular state of your complexion and curl of your hair to be described in all their diversities, without having constant recourse to a journal? My dear madam, I am not so ignorant of young ladies' ways as you wish to believe me. It is this delightful habit of journalising which largely contributes to form the easy style of writing for which ladies are so generally celebrated. Everybody allows the talent of writing agreeable letters is particularly female. Nature may have done something, but I'm sure it must be essentially assisted by the practice of keeping a journal." "I have sometimes thought," said Catherine, doubtingly, "whether ladies do write so much better letters than gentlemen. That is, I should not think the superiority always on our side. As far as I have had the opportunity of judging it, it appears to me that the usual style of letter writing among women is faultless, except in 3 particulars." "And what are they?" "A general deficiency of subject, a total inattention to stops, and a very frequent ignorance of grammar." "Upon my word, I need not have been afraid of disclaiming the compliment. You do not think too highly of us in that way." "I should no more lay it down as a general rule that women write better letters than men, than they sing better duets or draw better landscapes. In every power of which taste is the foundation, excellence is pretty fairly divided between the sexes." They were interrupted by Mrs. Allen. "My dear Catherine," she said, "do take this pin out of my sleeve. I'm afraid it has torn a hole already. I should be quite sorry if it has, for this is a favourite gown, though it cost but 9 shillings a yard." "That is exactly what I should have guessed it, madam," said Mr. Tilney, looking at the muslin. "Do you understand muslins, sir?" "Particularly well. I always buy my own cravats, and am allowed to be an excellent judge. My sister has often trusted me in the choice of a gown. I bought one for her the other day, and it was pronounced to be a prodigious bargain by every lady who saw it. I gave but 5 shillings a yard for it, and a true Indian muslin." Mrs. Allen was quite struck by his genius. "Men commonly take so little notice of those things," said she. "I can never get Mr. Allen to know one of my gowns from another. You must be a great comfort to your sister, sir." "I hope I am, madam." "And pray, sir, what do you think of Miss Morland's gown?" "I think it very pretty, madam," said he, gravely examining it, "but I do not think it will wash well. I'm afraid it will fray." "How can you," said Catherine, laughingly, "be so—" She had almost said strange. "I am quite of your opinion, sir," replied Mrs. Allen, "and so I told Miss Morland when she bought it. But then you know, madam, muslin always turns to some account or other. Miss Morland will get enough out of it for a handkerchief or a cap or a cloak. Muslin can never be said to be wasted. I have heard my sister say so 40 times when she has been extravagant in buying more than she wanted, or careless in cutting it to pieces. Bath is a charming place, sir, for there are so many good shops here. We are sadly off in the country, not but what we have very good shops in Salisbury, but it's so far to go. 8 miles is a long way. Mr. Allen says it's 9, measured 9, but I'm sure it cannot be more than 8. And it's such a fag, I come back tired to death. Now here one can step out of doors and get a thing in 5 minutes. Mr. Tilney was polite enough to seem interested in what she said, and she kept him on the subject of muslin till the dancing recommenced. Catherine feared, as she listened to their discourse, that he indulged himself a little too much with the foibles of others. "What are you thinking of so earnestly?" said he, as they walked back to the ballroom. Not of your partner, I hope, for by that shake of the head your meditations are not satisfactory. Catherine coloured and said, I was not thinking of anything. That is artful and deep, to be sure, but I had rather be told at once that you will not tell me. Well, then, I will not. Thank you, for now we shall soon be acquainted, as I am authorised to tease you on this subject whenever we meet, and nothing in the world advances intimacy so much. They danced again, and when the assembly closed, parted, on the ladies' side at least, with a strong inclination for continuing the acquaintance. Whether she thought of him so much while she drank her warm wine and water and prepared herself for bed, as to dream of him when there, cannot be ascertained, but I hope it was no more than a slight slumber or a morning doze at most, for if it be true, as the celebrated writer has maintained, that no young lady can be justified in falling in love before the gentleman's love is declared, it must be very improper that a young lady should dream of a gentleman before the gentleman is first known to have dreamt of her. How proper Mr. Tilney might be as a dreamer or a lover had not yet, perhaps, entered Mr. Allen's head, but that he was not objectionable as a common acquaintance for his young charge, he was on inquiry satisfied, for he had early in the evening taken pains to know who her partner was, and had been assured of Mr. Tilney's being a clergyman and of a very respectable family in Gloucestershire.
You're welcome. You have now met Mr. Tilney. I love Mr. Tilney. I love this scene of meeting Mr. Tilney. I find him to be absolutely fantastic in every possible way. And I'm not alone, because evidently Jane Austen really loved Mr. Tilney. But that also might be because Jane Austen pretty much wrote a male version of herself. And in fact, she gets completely meta with herself in these chapters. I will give you a for instance. There are several places where this happens, but in chapter 3, Mr. Tilney was polite enough to seem interested in what she said, and she kept him on the subject of muslins till the dancing recommenced. Catherine feared as she listened to their discourse that he indulged himself a little too much with the foibles of others, something with which Jane Austen has been accused herself. Lest we miss the fact that this is Jane Austen making fun of Jane Austen, later on the same page, Jane Austen uses in the narrative the personal I. This is the first time in the book, but not the last, where she allows herself to be the narrator. And it leads us into a footnote. Here's the comment that she makes. This is after they started dancing again. Whether she thought of him so much while she drank her warm wine and water and prepared herself for bed as to dream of him when there cannot be ascertained. But I hope it was no more than a slight slumber or a morning doze at most. For if it be true, as a celebrated writer has maintained, that no young lady can be justified in falling in love before the gentleman's love is declared, it must be very improper that a young lady should dream of a gentleman before the gentleman is first known to have dreamt of her. This is footnoted to a letter from Mr. Richardson in number 97, volume 2 of the Rambler. Here is the letter in the Rambler to which Jane Austen referred. This was written in 1751, so she's going back in time to an older edition. She is perhaps not an absolute stranger to the passions of the young gentleman. His eyes, his assiduities, his constant attendance at church, whether till of late he used seldom to come, and 1,000 little observances that he paid her, had very probably first forced her to regard, and then inclined her to favor him. That a young lady should be in love, and the love of the young gentleman undeclared, is a heterodoxy which prudence and even policy must not allow. He declares his passion, the consciousness of her own worth, and his application to her parents take from her any doubt of his sincerity, and she owns herself obliged to him for his good opinion. So she can't even get on with daydreaming about the guy until he lets her know that he digs her first. I don't think Jane Austen liked that very much. But she got to make fun of it. She got to make fun of making Mr. Tilney just a little bit too snarky, just like her, which is why we love her. Did you catch the journal joke as well? Catherine has come to Bath with a journal, absolutely yes, but it is the book into which she is supposed to write her sums of money that she has spent. Mr. Tilney calls her out for having a journal, which surprised her. Except he thinks it's a diary, and she knows it's not. So is she lying when she says she doesn't have a journal? No. Does he think she is, that she's just teasing back? Apparently so. I love this book. I also love that when he says, "What are you thinking?" Not of your partner, I hope, for by the shake of your head, your meditations are not satisfactory. Catherine colored and said, "I was not thinking of anything." His response, "That is artful and deep, to be sure. But I'd rather be told at once that you will not tell me." Artful and deep? No, she really actually wasn't thinking anything. She's just chilling. But he's generous and assumes that she must have been, or at least teases her, that she must have been thinking something very, very deep indeed. Probably about him. Conceited much? No. Oh, one other little tidbit of interest, because I'm sure it will come up again in another book that we read together in the future. Mr. Tilney comments on her sprigged gown. That's because it either has embossed on it or embroidered on it or painted on it sprigs of holly or some such greenery, or she is wearing sprigs on it. It is most likely the former. But he also mentions that she's wearing black shoes. This was actually of note because evidently at this time in Bath during a season, wearing a light muslin dress, not all of the girls would have been wearing black shoes. These are not big black clunky shoes. These are like dancing slippers. But even so, she probably was a bit of a standout in this. Her shoes would not have been particularly noticeable unless you were looking at her feet while she was dancing. So he was maybe trying to catch some ankle there. I don't know. But either way, he noticed, which is, as is still true today, worthy of note when a guy actually notices what you're wearing or that you've cut your hair or anything like that. Tilney notices. It's kind of nice. He's an interesting character. And, like Mr. Darcy, he is not without his prickly bits, which we will also come to know. But I will never not love him because of this first scene that we get with him. Ah, Mr. Tilney. Fabulous, fabulous introductory scene. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I hope you will continue to enjoy Northanger Abbey as we go through the rest of it. Take care. Have a great one. Be well. Wear a mask. Be safe. Keep each other safe. I'll talk to you soon. Bye. If you like what you hear on Craftlit, please review us on iTunes, like us on Facebook, join in the fun in our Facebook group, which is Craftlit Annotated Audiobooks. Always the nicest group of people you're going to find on Facebook, and the place where you can come to and say, nobody else was going to understand this, but I knew you all would. And of course, thank you for your support of Craftlit. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.